All right, welcome back for another deep dive here. And looks like we're tackling something pretty big today. Renaissance natural philosophy.
Yeah.
That's right up your alley, right? You
Right.
sent in some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah. This is definitely my jam.
So I guess, for anybody out there who's kind of fascinated by, how we got to where we are in terms of how we understand the world, and especially that transition, into modern science, this is going to be fascinating. So let's dive right in. What's our mission here? What are we going to try and unpack?
Okay, so basically what we're going to do in this deep dive is try to understand how thinkers during the Renaissance grappled with the natural world. And more importantly, or at least as importantly, understand what were the key shifts that happened between the medieval period and the Renaissance. And then crucially, what were some of the conceptual foundations that were laid during the Renaissance for the scientific revolution. I think it's helpful to think of this as a sort of curated journey. We're not going to get bogged down in every single detail, but we're going to try to hit the highlights and the important parts, the important shifts.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? We want to avoid getting lost in the weeds. But we do want to sort of surface those surprising insights that maybe we wouldn't immediately grasp, just by glancing at the subject. So as we navigate this really fascinating period, right, where there's so much intellectual ferment, we have to remember, or at least keep in mind, the looming presence, the huge influence of Aristotle. His framework remains absolutely central, right? It was almost a universal language for understanding nature. But the Renaissance wasn't simply a recitation of Aristotelian ideas. It was a period of really intense engagement, enrichment, and ultimately, I think, a significant expansion of his ideas. So Renaissance natural philosophy, it sounds like a very sort of straightforward historical category, right? But the source material kind of suggests it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So what were the inherent challenges in kind of neatly defining this thing?
Yeah, you're right to pick up on that. Like it is a bit tricky, right, defining Renaissance natural philosophy, because there's a danger of oversimplifying it. And we can oversimplify it in a couple of ways. One is to just basically see it as medieval science, just like a continuation of medieval science, or to see it as simply a precursor to the scientific revolution, right? So in a way, kind of ignoring all of the weird connections that thinkers in the Renaissance had with what we would now consider to be outside of science. Things like, astrology and natural magic and scholarly approaches have often fallen into these two camps. So one camp kind of emphasizes this continuity between, the medieval period and the Renaissance and kind of flattens the distinctions. And then the other camp, kind of really focuses intently on its role as a precursor to modern science.
So it's neither a mere echo of the past nor this sort of fully formed vision of the future.
Right.
There's something else going on here. So what would you say are some of the defining characteristics, or what are some of the intellectual currents that began to shift things?
Yeah, I think a really crucial shift that we see is a gradual move away from this really strong university-based practice of natural philosophy in the medieval period. The medieval period was very much invested in the corpus Aristotelicum, so basically the collected works of Aristotle. And while people definitely engaged critically with Aristotle in the medieval period, universities, particularly outside of Italy, often operated within fairly rigid intellectual boundaries where authorities exerted a lot of influence, and where metaphysics and theology held a lot of sway over inquiries into the natural world.
Oh, this is interesting. So the resurgence of Platonism sort of created more intellectual elbow room within the Aristotelian system itself.
It's a bit counterintuitive in a way, right? Because obviously Plato never really went away. His influence was always present, but the 15th century saw really a revival, and a consolidation of Neoplatonic thought. And this led to, I guess you could say, a clearer kind of intellectual division of labor in a way, where Plato became more associated with theology, with the realm of kind of metaphysical realities, whereas Aristotle became increasingly positioned as the authority on the observable world, right, the changeable sublunar world. And so this kind of renewed ancient distinction between Plato and Aristotle in a way actually sort of loosened the grip, or weakened the tight bonds between Aristotelianism and Scholasticism, and opened up some new philosophical spaces where people could think about things in a way that wasn't so directly constrained by purely metaphysical or theological considerations. And engaging with Plato actually led some people to question even the internal consistency of Aristotle's system itself.
Well, that's fascinating. So it's almost like Platonism was a wedge, right? That kind of like created these openings within the dominant Aristotelian framework. So, and it wasn't just Plato making a comeback, right?
Yeah.
You had other ancient schools of thought as well.
Yeah, that's right. So Stoicism also kind of had a revival, skepticism, and Epicureanism as well. And so, all of these different sort of schools of thought, these philosophical schools, offered Renaissance thinkers a sort of different, framework for understanding the natural world. And I think this engagement with this diverse range of ancient ideas is really what gives Renaissance natural philosophy its own distinctive character, right? So it's a field that's constantly in dialogue, in tension, even with Aristotelianism. So Aristotle is always there, but his authority is being actively negotiated, reinterpreted, and challenged even, both by supporters and by those who are seeking to sort of move beyond that traditional university paradigm.
And it wasn't just a purely abstract realm of philosophical debate either. I mean, the encyclopedia entry points to a number of kind of more tangible non-philosophical factors that are also at play here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the printing press, right? I mean, the invention and the spread of the printing press completely revolutionized the way that knowledge was disseminated. New technologies like the telescope, the microscope, this literally opened up new worlds to observation. Geographical discoveries, challenged assumptions about the Earth and its inhabitants. And even within the universities themselves, you see, the establishment of botanical gardens, for example. The signaled a growing emphasis on direct empirical study. So all of these kind of non-speculative developments, really shaped the trajectory of natural philosophy during the Renaissance.
So we've kind of established a sense, I think, of what Renaissance natural philosophy was. It's this dynamic field with Aristotle at its core, but it's being profoundly shaped by other ancient philosophies and responding to this wave of new technologies and discoveries. So let's talk about the universities, because they're still, the primary centers of intellectual life. Mm-hmm. What did the curriculum look like for somebody studying natural philosophy?
So the corpus Aristotelicum formed really the bedrock of university teaching in natural philosophy, and its sheer breadth, right? Because Aristotle covered, practically every known subject. This is what made it so appealing. It's almost like a self-contained system. So while the physics provided a sort of general framework, and sometimes the physics was even seen as bordering on metaphysics, we had specific treatises, like on the heavens, meteorology, and on generation and corruption, which dealt with sort of more particular aspects of the natural world. And what's interesting, I think, is that there wasn't a sort of widespread movement to fundamentally revise the kind of Aristotelian canon, the texts that constituted the core curriculum, although there was one notable exception, Peter Ramus, or Pierre de la Rame in French. He argued for greater emphasis on specific mathematical and physical sciences over the more general physics.
So you've got these Aristotelian texts, right? They're basically the textbooks of the day. So how were they actually engaged with it? I mean, I imagine it wasn't simply a matter of students kind of sitting there in quiet contemplation reading these texts.
No, not at all. No, I mean the traditional method of studying Aristotle was through commentaries, and in particular commentaries written by the medieval Islamic philosopher Averroes, and these commentaries, they provided a really structured way to unpack, Aristotle's often dense arguments. However, the Renaissance saw a broadening of the influential commentators. So you see, the works of earlier Greek commentators like Alexander of Aphrodisias, who was known for his views on the mortality of the soul, and Simplicius, who often adopted a sort of more Neoplatonic and conciliatory approach. These gained a lot of traction during the Renaissance. And in addition to these sort of established voices, Renaissance professors increasingly started to write their own commentaries, and these often followed the structure of Averroes, but sometimes they focus more on specific philosophical questions, these questions that arose from the text. And crucially, there was a growing emphasis on actually consulting the original Greek texts alongside the Latin translations that had really dominated the medieval period, and this reflected, of course, the broader humanistic interest in the classics and the original sources.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the printing press, the printing press really must have just totally altered the landscape of how these scholarly materials circulated and were accessed.
Yeah, transformative, totally transformative. It made a much wider range of educational materials available. I mean, you see everything from, these concise introductory texts for students to these comprehensive compendia, that summarize Aristotelian thought. You have paraphrases like those produced by Lefebvre d'Etaples that aim to sort of clarify complex passages. You even have, dialogues, these philosophical dialogues that presented, debates in a more engaging format. And abridged versions of Aristotle's ideas, these are often presented as a series of concise conclusion, as like Bricot's Textus Abbreviatus, that became widely used as a teaching aid. And the textbooks themselves were typically organized, either according to the structure of Aristotle's corpus or thematically. So, focusing on core concepts like, the fundamental principles nature, the four causes, the nature of motion, the problem of the void, and the commentary Conimbrescenses, which was this huge commentary, this comprehensive systematic commentary produced by the Jesuit scholars at the University of Coimbra, that eventually became sort of a standard reference work within their huge network of educational institutions.
So it does sound like a fairly standardized curriculum, at least within the universities, but was there any sort of intellectual ferment or any push for alternative approaches within that setting?
Well, yeah, I mean, while the Aristotelian framework was definitely dominant within the universities, the increasing circulation of vernacular treatments of natural philosophy, I think this suggests a growing desire to kind of engage a wider audience, right? Maybe even beyond the traditional sort of academic sphere. So you start to see translations, paraphrases, and summaries of Aristotelian ideas appearing in languages like Italian and French. Some of these are even specifically aimed at students who might not have had a strong grounding in Latin. So it's a hint that the intellectual landscape is broadening a little bit. There's a growing interest in these topics beyond the confines of Latinate scholarly discourse.
So the university is sort of central players, but there's this kind of expression of interest that is perhaps outside of that traditional structure. Now the encyclopedia entry also goes into some detail about the relationships and the sometimes the rivalries that natural philosophy had with other disciplines. And I mean, medicine immediately strikes me as a field where there's going to be a lot of overlap.
Yeah, the relationship with medicine was very close, and Aristotle himself, acknowledged this connection in his writings, and in many Italian universities, a grounding in philosophy was often a prerequisite for medical studies, and it wasn't uncommon at all for prominent Renaissance natural philosophers to also be practicing physicians, and there was even a well-known proverb that kind of speaks to this relationship, this kind of ambiguous boundary, and the proverb is ubi desinit philosophus, or physicus, in cipit medicus, which means, where the natural philosopher leaves off, the physician begins. So on the one hand, this is saying that at a certain point, theoretical understanding needs to give way to, the practical application of medical knowledge. But on the other hand, it also sort of affirms, the importance of natural philosophy as a kind of necessary foundation for medical theory and practice. So it's both, right? It's this kind of ambiguous relationship where you could either see philosophy as providing the essential theoretical framework, or you could see medicine as a distinct field that ultimately sort of supersedes philosophical speculation.
Right. And then there's this whole debate during the Renaissance concerning the relative authority of Aristotle and Galen, right, in medical matters.
That's right. So Aristotle was still held in high regard, right, for his comprehensive system. But Galen offered, much more detailed and specific anatomical observations, physiological theories, and because some of their disagreements, really stemmed from differing methodologies, right? So you have the more speculative approach of Aristotle versus Galen's emphasis on empirical observation. There were a lot of attempts during the Renaissance to try to reconcile their seemingly conflicting views and to create a sort of more unified, understanding of the human body and how it works.
Okay. And then what about astrology? Because that seems like another area where you've got this kind of this shared interest in the natural world, but perhaps with a very different explanatory framework.
Yeah. Astrology was often compared and contrasted with natural philosophy. And one Jesuit scholar, Benito Pereira, he argued that the two differed fundamentally in their approach. So he said that natural philosophy operates a priori, right? it seeks to understand the underlying causes of natural phenomena, whereas astrology is more a posteriori. It's focused more on observing correlations between celestial events and terrestrial occurrences. But Pereira also makes this interesting observation that natural philosophy seemed to struggle more than other disciplines like logic or metaphysics in clearly defining its own boundaries and its scope.
Oh, that's fascinating. Like there's this perceived fluidity of natural philosophy's domain. And then the entry also mentions the surprising role of ethics in the natural philosophy curriculum. I mean, how did those two seemingly distinct areas connect?
Well, it was fairly common for university courses on Aristotle's physics to begin with, a lecture on ethics. And this tradition was often traced back to Averroes, his argument for the moral superiority of the contemplative or speculative life. But also, discussions about things like the immortality of the soul, the nature of the human will, topics with clear ethical implications. These frequently made their way into lecture notes and commentaries on natural philosophy. So, in a way, it blurred the lines between these seemingly separate, fields of inquiry.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these seemingly separate fields are bleeding into each other. Okay, so we've explored, I think, how natural philosophy was taught and how it intersected with other disciplines within the traditional university structure. But the Renaissance is also this period where you have this real flourishing of intellectual life outside of the established academic institutions,
right?
Academies and other learned societies.
Exactly. So you see the emergence of, these academies and learned societies, and even literary societies, like the Accademia Fiorentina. They would sometimes host debates on scientific topics, but more specialized groups, like the Accademia delle Scienze, which was founded in the early 17th century. These focused explicitly on the study of science and mathematics, consciously kind of avoiding non-scientific controversy.
Okay, so the Lindsay almost sounds like a kind of precursor to modern scientific societies. But what would you say distinguished them from these later organizations like the Royal Society?
Well, the Accademia delle Scienze and later the Accademia del Cimento, they often benefited from the patronage of wealthy aristocratic families. They didn't quite achieve the same level of kind of long-term stability and widespread impact as later state-sponsored, organizations like the Royal Society or the Académie Royale des Sciences in France. And these later societies, which often grew out of, more informal gatherings of intellectuals, they really actively promoted collaboration. They really facilitated the open exchange of ideas, and they even organized public demonstrations of experimental work. So there's a shift away from secrecy, which had characterized, some of the earlier, scientific pursuits.
It seems like the support of wealthy patrons, rulers. this played a really vital role in the development of natural philosophy, even outside of these formal academies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Renaissance lords and other powerful patrons, they often displayed a keen interest in scientific works, particularly those that had practical applications in areas like military technology, right? So treatises on things like metallurgy, fortification, ballistics, these were highly valued. But there was also an interest in kind of more entertaining, curious topics. Mm-hmm. These were often referred to as parva naturalia, which could be anything from natural wonders to astrological predictions, and exceptional natural events, things like earthquakes. These would often prompt a flurry of publications, people trying to explain the causes and the significance of these events. And these were eagerly sought after by those in positions of power. And some rulers even, cultivated personal interests in fields like alchemy and directly supported scientific investigation, especially in areas like zoology and botany, which they require considerable resources for the collection of specimens and the employment of skilled artists to create accurate illustrations, which of course were crucial for classification, right? For scientific classification.
And that emphasis on accurate representation, in scientific illustration, it seems to mirror a broader trend toward greater accuracy in the understanding and transmission of knowledge, particularly through the lens of philology, right? Mm-hmm. The study of classical texts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the same drive for accuracy, that informs scientific illustration, also fueled a renewed focus on producing more reliable editions and translations of classical scientific texts. And this was, of course, greatly accelerated by the advent of the printing press. So Aldus Manutius is his famous edition of the Greek Aristotle that prioritized the scientific works, for example. But Pliny's natural history probably underwent the most intense philological scrutiny, and humanists and physicians alike produced increasingly sophisticated emendations and vernacular translations. And the aim here was really to ensure the most accurate understanding of the text, particularly for medical practitioners, apothecaries who relied on this information. And the same kind of rigorous attention was paid to Dioscorides' Materia Medica, which was another kind of foundational text for medical audiences. And it's interesting, even literary figures like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid found their way into discussions about botany, and even philological analysis of the Bible occasionally, yielded insights that were considered relevant to natural philosophical inquiries.
Wow, so it's interesting to see how this humanistic emphasis on textual precision is kind of intertwined with the this emerging empirical focus, right? On actually observing the world, the natural world directly, and the rise of botanical gardens. I mean, this seems like a very concrete manifestation of that growing value placed on firsthand knowledge.
Absolutely. So, the establishment of botanical gardens in cities like Pisa, Padua, Florence, and later, of course, in other European centers, this signaled a growing recognition of the importance of empirical investigation. Even within the traditionally more text-focused universities, although it's important to note that chairs in botany often held a lower status compared to those in more speculative fields, but the creation of these comprehensive catalogs of animals and plants during this period, by figures like Bellon, Rondelet, and Aldrovandi, this really exemplifies this blend of textual authority and empirical observation. So these authors combine knowledge gleaned from classical texts with direct observations and information gathered from individuals with practical firsthand experience of the natural world. So fishermen, sailors, peasants, sort of the invisible technicians of the time. And even in fields like mineralogy, significant contributions came from individuals without, formal Latin education, people like Leonardo da Vinci or Bernard Palissy, who recognized fossils, as the products of organic processes, challenging prevailing textual interpretations.
And the European voyages of discovery, right? The Americas. I mean, that must have been a huge challenge to the authority of established thinkers like Aristotle, whose knowledge of the natural world was largely confined to the Mediterranean region.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this was huge. So this encounter with entirely new continents, with flora and fauna that were completely unknown to the classical world. This directly contradicted certain Aristotelian doctrines. Pomponazzi, he famously used the accounts of navigators like Pigafetta to basically publicly mock Aristotle's claim, about the uninhabitability of the torrid zone. So this influx of new information underscored the limitations of a purely text-based approach to understanding the natural world, and it really fueled this growing emphasis on direct observation and empirical investigation, which was championed by thinkers like Lorenzo Valla, who advocated for the use of common sense to critique Aristotelian absurdities, and Leonardo da Vinci, who really stressed this crucial link between scientific understanding and practical application. And I think Tommaso Campanella's famous, assertion that he learned more from the anatomy of an ant or an herb than from any book. I think this really nicely encapsulates this emerging, methodological conviction.
So you have this real tension, right? And eventually this significant shift, I think, from this reliance on ancient texts as the ultimate source of knowledge to a greater emphasis on this direct observation, this empirical investigation. So let's dig into some of the specific Aristotelian tenets that came under scrutiny during the Renaissance. And the encyclopedia entry sort of outlined some key areas like, the fundamental principles of matter, cosmology, which is always, fascinating, and even ideas about miracles and magic. So let's start with the fundamental principles of matter. What were the core Aristotelian ideas there, and how did Renaissance thinkers kind of engage with and often challenge them?
So the principal tenets of Aristotelian natural philosophy, these included the fundamental distinction between form and matter, the concept of the four causes, the division of the cosmos into distinct, and qualitatively different, sublunar, which is, the changeable, and superlunar realms, which is the unchangeable realm, and the notion of a finite universe. So, during the Renaissance, each of these ideas was actively debated, revised, and in many cases fundamentally challenged. And this was often spurred by new, empirical findings, by alternative philosophical frameworks, and sometimes even purely speculative arguments. So regarding the fundamental principles of matter, Aristotle posited matter, form, and privation as the basic constituents of the mutable sublunar world, and he contrasted this with the immutable ether, which comprised the superlunar realm. And Bernardino Telesio, he was a really vocal critic of Aristotelianism, and he proposed an alternative set of principles based on sensory experience. So he had passive matter and two active forces, heat and cold. And he argued that the interaction of these, fundamental principles, this drove all natural processes. And quite radically, he suggested that all things possess a degree of sensation, which is linked to their, sort of instinct for self-preservation. And Tommaso Campanella, while he differed in some of the details, he echoed this emphasis on sensation as a fundamental property of nature, and linked this to his understanding of natural magic. So Telesio's focus on empirical observation, this was quite influential. But even those who were sympathetic to alternative philosophies like the Platonist Francesco Patrizzi, they criticized Telesio's apparent dismissal of the need for underlying metaphysical principles. And Francis Bacon, who was really staunch advocate for more rigorously experimental form of empiricism, he also criticized Telesio for what he saw as an insufficient grounding in empirical data, an over-reliance on speculative assumptions.
So the very nature of matter itself becomes this point of significant contention, right, within and outside of the Aristotelian framework.
Yeah, absolutely. So within Aristotelianism, there was this ongoing debate about the precise nature of prime matter. So, was it prop nihil, as some argued, meaning almost pure potentiality with very little, actual existence, or did it possess, some inherent degree of actuality? And Platonic philosophy, particularly as it was revived and reinterpreted by Marsilio Ficino in his Platonic theology, this offered a sort of contrasting perspective. So they suggested that prime matter existed independently of form and even possessed a certain kind of intelligible quality, although it was weak. Giordano Bruno, he went even further. He proposed this really radical view of matter as an inherently active principle, containing within itself the potential for all forms, essentially, a form of infinite dynamic substance. And this was central to his cosmological vision, of an infinite universe. Campanella, by contrast, he returned to a more traditional understanding, identifying matter primarily with physical bodies and emphasizing its passive role as a recipient of forms. And the Aristotelian concept of the eternity of matter, this also presented significant theological challenges, right, to the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And this led to some really, direct intellectual confrontations between Aristotelian and Platonic viewpoints on the origin and nature of matter. And so you have figures like Johannes Bessarion and Ficino. They aligned with Plato's idea of a created prime matter with a sort of superior, divinely bestowed eternity. Nevertheless, Aristotelians like Sebastiano Timpanaro de Vimercato, they continued to defend the Aristotelian notion of the eternity of prime matter. And this debate persisted, well into the 17th century. We see it in things like Crivolati's dialogues. And there were even attempts to synthesize these differing views as we see in the work of Sebastian Fox Marsillo, who sought to find common ground between Plato and Aristotle.
And then you've got the alchemists and the emerging sort of chemical perspectives on matter. And these offer kind of a very different
way of understanding the fundamental constituents of the world.
Yeah, that's right. So the alchemists, people like Paracelsus, they sought to identify a kind of fundamental principle that underlay all material substances, and they proposed a system based on the 4 Aristotelian elements plus this triadic principle of sulfur, mercury, and salt. And Paracelsus, drew some inspiration from Aristotle's meteorology and his understanding of the formation of metals. And Paracelsus's work, with its emphasis on the separation and the recombination of substances, this really played a crucial role in this transformation of alchemy into this more sort of systematic discipline of chemistry. Jan Baptist van Helmont, who was a contemporary of Paracelsus, he developed a corpuscular theory of matter that stood in opposition to Paracelsus's triadic system. The resurgence of atomism during the Renaissance, this was often linked to Neoplatonic ideas about fundamental seeds or semina, and also the ancient philosophy of Epicurus. And this was typically advocated by thinkers who were critical of Aristotle. People like Bruno. He directly contradicted Aristotle's very strong rejection of the existence of atoms and the void. Within the sort of broadly Aristotelian tradition, the medieval concept of minima naturalia, which refers to the smallest natural units, beyond which a substance couldn't be further divided without losing its essential form. This offered a way to understand, how substances could combine, and this idea was further developed by philosophers like Agostino Nifo and Julius Caesar Scaliger, with Scaliger arguing for the existence of real indivisible physical components while still rejecting traditional atomism on the grounds that it lacked the necessary continuity to explain natural phenomena. And thinkers like Van Helmont and Daniel Sennert built upon this tradition of minima naturalia to develop their own forms of corpuscularism, with Sennert even, trying to reconcile Aristotelian ideas of substantial form with a more atomistic understanding of matter. Others, like Pierre Gassendi's teacher, Jean-Baptiste Basson, they proposed corpuscular theories while denying the existence of a void and kind of resisting this purely mechanistic explanation of nature. In contrast, Galileo Galilei.